Hello, my name is Bianca Diaz, and I'm an artist and an illustrator. And I'm from Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood. Um, and today I'd like to share with you my process that I took in illustrating my first children's book, The One Day House, which was written by Julia Durango. So you can start the slideshow, I think. Yes, thank you. So this is me in my studio, and you can follow me on Instagram at Bianca Diaz Art. I do mainly kind of analog illustration, so not digital. So my whole presentation will kind of center around that. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I'll just cover a little bit of my art education with you quickly. There's a lot of ways to get into this work, and I'm just going to explain the way that I did, but a lot of people take different routes. Some people are like totally untrained or self-taught and are very successful that way as well. So, but this is the way that I did it. So as a teen, I attended the Marwin Arts Program, and it's a free after-school arts program for young people throughout Chicago for grades 6 through 12. And they provided everything for free materials, studio space, college and career programming. I would highly recommend this program if you're a young person in the Chicago area. And then I went to Gallery 37 in my later years of high school, and I did advanced placement drawing and painting courses, which kind of helped me build up a portfolio of work and just really got me ready for the college application process. So that was also extremely beneficial, and I would highly recommend that program. And then I went to the Rhode Island School of Design, and I got a BFA in illustration in 2013. And while I was there, I took a lot of different courses about illustration and children's book illustration, printmaking, and just like kind of expanding my techniques and knowledge. And then in 2015, I graduated from the National University of Ireland with an MA in Creative Process. And that was part of a program called Uversity, where you kind of get to mix and match courses from different majors and different institutions and go to different parts of Ireland each semester and study. So that was a really amazing program, and it kind of introduced me to art therapy, like the beginnings of it. And I try to use some of that knowledge in my work. So that's my education. This next slide. So like I said, I'll be talking to you about my first children's book, The One Day House. And this book, written by Julia Durango, is about a young boy named Wilson who wants to help fix up his elderly neighbor's home. Her name is Gigi. And in the book, he basically dreams throughout the entire story about what he would like to fix about his neighbor's home. And he's just talking to everyone in the neighborhood about it. And you kind of see through the book how he makes this dream become a reality. So next slide. So I figured I'd start by basically showing you how you start. So I got the manuscript from the publisher. The way that I got connected with this publisher was for my final class of my children's book illustration course, my teacher organized different editors and art directors from various publishers to kind of sit in our critique, which was an amazing experience. And they liked my manuscript that I wrote and made a book dummy for. A book dummy is like your whole manuscript, but brought to life. So every page is sketched out like in pencil, and then 2 pages are in full color. So they liked my manuscript and kept it. But nothing really has happened with that so far yet since then, but I'm still kind of like developing that. But they did show me someone else's work that I agreed to illustrate, and that was The One Day House. So this is how it'll look if you get a manuscript from a publisher. They kind of paginate it. Usually books start on either 3 or 4 and 5. Next slide. And then they'll show, some of them will show like the notes for like that stuff in blue there is for author's notes for what they imagine would be in the illustration. So these are just ones that I pulled offline, but you can, yeah, look up examples of this for yourself. Next slide. So this is, I just drew this up really fast. This is the typical layout of a children's book, and most of them are 32 pages. So this is shows the front cover, you know, the end pages, title page, publishing page, dedication page. That's why most books start on page 4 and 5. So that's also something that you can look up, that template. And so these are also like thumbnails. So a thumbnail is just like a little small square, and it's meant to help you get your ideas together for how you want the drawing to look without making it really big and like not wasting, but spending more time doing a bigger drawing. So yeah, that's like the basics. So next slide. So once I got the manuscript, I liked it. I started to sketch out the characters. So this was my initial sketches for Wilson and Gigi. And these aren't in the book anywhere, and it's not even the same style as the book, but I just combined different photo references and just like to imagine these characters. And I referred to them throughout the process of making the book. So for me, it was important to do these. Next slide. This is a picture of the house that the author had in her head when she wrote this book. It's sort of like a Victorian house. And so I wanted to set this book in Chicago. So I thought of different neighborhoods that might have like that kind of old style house. And then I combined it with a lot of elements of my neighborhood, Pilsen, just because it's important for me to like represent my neighborhood. I think it's underrepresented in children's literature. It's a working class Mexican American neighborhood. So I just try to bring that into my work as much as I can. Next slide. So this is the house sketches, just like early imaginings of what the house might look like. Next slide. And this is what it ended up being. So you can see I took notes like everything about the house that needed to be fixed needed to be in there. So I needed to make sure like I showed that the stairs were broken, that the windows were broken, that the paint was chipping. Like, so I just made these kind of notes on my sketches as I go. Next slide. So then the next thing I did was I went on Google Earth, which is, I really love using that as an artistic tool. I found houses that I could use, and I kind of composited them together for inspiration for the book. And yeah, so it's just, again, this wasn't in the book, but this was something that I referred to, you know, for continuity, like the street has to look the same every time and from every angle. So just seeing it laid out like this really helped me imagine it. Next slide. Sorry if I'm going a little fast. I want to cover a lot, but this will be on YouTube after this, so you can kind of slow it down later. But so this is an example of my sketchbook, kind of what would be in there. So you see those little thumbnails. I'm starting to kind of draw out and imagine the scenes. And you can see like I wrote down everything that needed to be fixed, and then every neighbor that needed to be shown, and then who could potentially do what. Kind of helps me just keep track of everything that needs to be, all these problems that need to be solved through illustration. Next slide. So these are just some more thumbnails. I typically do at least 5 per page, probably. I guess I just try to see it from as many angles as possible. Next slide. So you can see like the notes, like here I was trying to figure out how do I show that her windows are broken? I was like, maybe it'll be a view from inside her kitchen. She's baking and it's really hot, but she can't open the windows. That was like an early idea. Next slide. So once I had all my thumbnails kind of, or at least some of them figured out, I kind of jumped ahead and was like, okay, let me start sketching now. And And I went into it with India ink. I don't know why, or walnut ink, sorry. I don't know why I did that. It was my first book, so I was still kind of like figuring out my process. So in this presentation, I'm kind of showing you like my mistakes also. So hopefully you can learn from them and streamline your process. But I realized with these walnut ink, next slide, with these walnut ink drawings that it was too unforgiving of a material to work with. I couldn't erase anything, you know, it was just too much too soon. Next slide. So you see, like, I'm still like ideating, you know, there's like a flyer on this that's supposed to be like a wooden pole. And you know how like there's flyers and lots of staples on it. I wanted to show that, but I ended up not going with that idea in the end. Next slide. Yeah, so like that's as many walnut ink drawings as I did. And then I was like, okay, this is not working because now I need to change these. So next slide. I went back into pencil. And you can just keep kind of scrolling through these. Next slide, yeah. So I did them in pencil, just kind of, these are early sketches. Oh, and you can see like the editor sent me the layout of the book, like the size that it would be, and then I just kind of printed them out. It made it much easier than figuring all that stuff out myself. Next slide. So these were like, I think I did these after those really detailed pencil ones, or maybe before, but these were, I sent these to the publisher and they're like, this is still too loose. Next slide. They couldn't really tell, you know, exactly what I was trying to show. I was just trying to get the whole book kind of sketched out quickly, but it was still too kind of thumbnail like. Next slide. Yeah, same thing. These are all just like my ideas. Next slide. And you can see I'm taking notes about what time of day it is, what month it is, and that was really important to me to show the passage of time, like a year passed. Next slide. So, you know, I scrapped all of that again, and I was like, well, I didn't scrap it, but I kind of built off it again. I was like, okay, now I need to do like really defined pencil sketches, and not every illustrator works this way, but I think because I was new, they just wanted to see more of an idea of how it would look. But also it helps me if my sketches are really defined, and they're pencil, so I can always change them. But next slide. So I just started kind of doing more detailed drawings, and this is an early idea for like a interior page of the book. Like pages 3 and 4 maybe, and showing a map of the neighborhood. But in the end, I think I decided against that. I figured there was a more personal way to kind of show the neighborhood. Next slide. So you can see, instead of like Wilson finding that flyer on that pole, you now see that you see him seeing it, and then that kind of starts off the story. And it's like a wordless page where the dedications and the publisher's info went. So you don't always have to start the book on page 4 or 5. You can start with like, you know, just the images earlier. Next slide. So this is another sketch. I wanted to show an ice cream truck because that's like something that a lot of us can relate to, especially if you live in the city. And there was, for this page, I was supposed to show the windows, you know, how he wants the windows open for her so she can feel the breeze. And you can see like through the window of the truck, very slightly, the windows are broken, but I realized that wasn't enough. So I kind of changed that later. And then I also, the truck is called Melky Yummies. And I had just read 100 Years of Solitude, and I was really inspired by the character Melquiades, who brings ice to the village, and brings all these inventions to the people of Macondo. So I kind of made him like a philosopher type and like kind of absent-minded. And he's like dropping this cone while he's like kind of talking to Wilson, but they didn't feel that there was enough connection between them. And I agreed. That's like one thing with children's books is it's a super collaborative process, and you have to be okay with getting notes. And of course, sometimes it'll annoy you, but just like sit with it and process it. And then a lot of the times it makes it better. So that's one thing about illustration. It's not only yours, it's a group effort. And that's something that I really love about illustration. Next slide. So here I wanted to show the paint and how Wilson wanted it to look like sunshine yellow. So I was trying to show, the hot summer vibe, but then again, there wasn't enough connection between these characters. And this is like the very first page, kind of your intro, besides the cover to them. So I changed that later. I can show that later. Next slide. Early on in the book, so this is something I wanted to touch on. You're kind of meant to show more than more than what the text says. So the illustrations bring the story even more to life. And you don't want to just show exactly what the words say, because that's a little bit boring. So early on, I decided Wilson would be making art and drawings and writing, and I just like getting his ideas out of his head onto paper or whatever surface, to get his ideas out of himself, which I think is, in general, I really like that idea. Just showing kids how to get from, the idea to making it happen. Next slide. So once I had like that sketch, I was like, okay, let me start with the final art for this page then. And then I just started painting. I use watercolor just because I love it. You can use literally anything to make children's books, but it's still toxic, less so. It doesn't have like fumes, but I do use cadmium paint, so you have to be careful, like not to spray them or inhale them in any way. But yeah, so I jumped ahead, started this, was wondering about, you can see kind of on the right, there's like a light blue area that I'm like trying to decide if I like the way that looks. But I don't know, I was talking to my editor and she was like, well, maybe you need to do color thumbnails. And I was like, oh, right. Because I kind of jumped ahead onto my expensive paper using my expensive watercolors. And then I was like, okay, I can figure out the colors at a miniature scale and that will work better. Next slide. So I kind of took that advice. I think I took it a little slowly, but I figured it out eventually, a process that worked for me. I started coloring it on like printer paper. I use a lot of printer paper for the sketching and everything of my book. But yeah, so this is still bigger, but at least it's not expensive paper that I'm figuring out the color scheme on. Next slide. So, these are just early concepts for the sky. I decided it was too distracting from what the focal point should be, which was the house. Next slide. So here you can see the colors that I did end up using. And yeah, it's like way too big. I could have just done that on a thumbnail. Next slide. So here's how I do my thumbnails. These are all the sketches, the bigger sketches, scanned in and then made small. I like compile them all on one 8.5 by 11 page on Photoshop. And eventually I just paint directly over them with watercolor. So once I had this, next slide, I printed them out, and then I am a big lover since I was a kid of tiny books and tiny things. So I just made a tiny little book. It's like this big. I cut out those thumbnails and then glue stick them together and made a little book, and it kind of helped me see, from page to page, is it working? Is it, are the transitions good? And I wouldn't say this is 100% necessary, but I like doing it, so to me, that's a good enough reason to do it. Next slide. So this is a image of from a different book, but this is how I do it now. So I get one sketch, scan it in, and then repeat it 3 times at a smaller scale on printer paper. And then I print that out, and then I paint directly on top of that. And the reason I do that 3 times is because I can try different colors, cut things out and paste it over the top one, like just, easily try different things and mix and match and collage it to, figure it out. This process, I'm sure, would be way easier digitally. And it does make me a slower creator, but I have made peace with that, because I really like working this way. And I think if I did this part digitally and then tried to paint it, analog with real paints later, there'd just be too much of a like discord, I think there. Next slide. So I just wanted to also go over with you guys, the basics like palettes and paints. These are all the things that I wish my favorite illustrators would talk about, like what they use. So I'm gonna share that with you guys. I started off using the top left palette. It's plastic. It has like squares, sharp edges that are kind of hard to clean in those corners. So I got a new one, which was the bottom left. All the edges are rounded in there, much easier to clean. I liked it for a long time, and they're really cheap. You can get them at Blick. But one day I bought one of those plastic ones, and it made the watercolors bead up. So if you don't know what that means, it's like, instead of, you see how they're like, you can see them flat, like you can see the color spread out, and it stays that way when it dries. When it beads, it like forms into puddles, and you can't even see like what you're mixing. So I would say if you have a palette that beads, it's not helping you with your color theory and stuff like that. So I ended up working with ceramic. You can use any kind of ceramic. The plate works. The one that I ended up getting, next slide, is this one from Target. I think it was like, I don't know, $8 or less. And it just always works. You can count on ceramic to never bead up. So basically, yeah, with paint, I try to get the highest grade that I can now. I didn't always work that way. I couldn't always afford that. For most of my life, I used whatever I could get. So whatever you can get works, and all that matters is that you do your work. But it is very fun to work with the higher grade paints because of the pigment quality. Like, you use way less paint, you get way more saturated colors. It's just easier. You're not fighting with the material as much. So I have like 13 colors that I use that I feel is very necessary. I don't use black ever. I also wanted to talk about color harmony and how that's like really important in any work, but really in a book. And I think one of my secrets, it's not really a secret, just mix your colors together. Like, if you're, you can see on these palettes, like on the right one, I was doing like a desert scene. So there's a lot of browns mixed with yellows. You bring the reds and the purples, like they're all interacting on the palette. That's what kind of helps you bring harmony, bring one color into all the others. Next slide. So I use paint from tubes. I use Daniel Smith, Holbein, and Winsor Newton. And it doesn't matter, once you get to the higher quality brands, it just go based on which shade of that color you like. So there's like, I love Burnt Sienna from Winsor Newton, but not Daniel Smith. So just add to your palette over time. I find that very fun. Let's see. This is like one of those art rules that my teacher told me in high school, but I stuck with it. I don't use black ever. Sometimes I use white, very rarely, but mainly I get blacks by mixing ultramarine blue and burnt umber. So it's like a dark brown and a dark blue, or like a deep blue, and mixing them together gives you a good black, I guess. And the reason for that is black kind of grays things out and makes everything feel gray, and it doesn't, to me, reflect like the quality of light. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right, but yeah, that's my own thing. You can use black. Everyone has their own thing. Okay, next slide. This is just a color study example. So showing how different colors look if you overlap blue over yellow instead of yellow over blue. You can see they're kind of harmonious together because they're all mixing into each other. Next slide. This is something I wanted to touch on briefly. I use a lot of different kind of synthetic paint brushes, and those run out quickly because the tips wear down very easily. I've started to use the Kolinsky Series 7 Winsor Newton brushes recently because they're sable and they hold a tip like for years if you take care of them. Sometimes you need that fine tip so you're not fighting against your materials. And then I also always have like a piece of paper on the side, which is that middle picture, to test out the paint on the brush, like how thick or thin it is before I get started. Next slide. So this is an example of the thumbnail. So on the left, you can see like it's much brighter and lighter, and like I wanted to convey hope. So color is really important for how you express emotion. The one on the right is more drab and kind of sad. And then the one on the left is like, I don't know, to me, it just like lifts that kite up like that, like burst of yellow in the back. And it shows that season better. Next slide. Here's another thumbnail of that one from earlier. You can see that I have Gigi now sitting by a kiddie pool outside because, you know, her windows are broken. So it's a little more story to kind of help the child understand that the windows are broken. And I showed, you know, Wilson and the ice cream man interacting more. And then I had this red stripe on the top and bottom of the ice cream truck, but I felt that was too distracting. Next slide. So I decided to make slide. Oops. So you see, oh, sorry, next slide. There you go, thank you. So I'm trying to build suspense. This is near the end of the book. Their faces are in shadow. The light is yellow for the conclusion of the book, which is next slide. Everyone shows up and helps Gigi fix her home. So she's like, has that surprise. And I think that like pop of yellow adds to that. And there's like yellow underneath every color in this page. Next slide. So these are the color thumbnails that I did. I scanned those in too. And then of course, next slide. These are the last of them. Next slide. So I made another little book just for myself, but also just to see like how things are transitioning. So if you want to, you can do that. Next slide. So you can see on this, I'm going to start showing you some of the final art. I hope I'm not running out of time. I'll try to go fast. You can see on the left, there's a bit more connection between them now. He's, you know, you see the shadow on him, but I'm glad I went with the one on the right because it shows like that eye contact more so. And you also see like his little drawing in his backpack. Next slide. This is some homemade paper that I made from old magazines that I found. Basically, I make paper out of garbage. And I chose to use this for the sidewalk texture throughout the book because I feel like it really reflects kind of the my neighborhood and like old sidewalks. Next slide. So you can see like this, you know, this thumbnail turns into this next slide, final art. So you can see I use that paper there in the sidewalk, and there's like a flyer that changed from the thumbnail. So I'm always kind of tweaking and changing things up to the last minute. Next slide. So here's another thumbnail. You can see like I had a rooftop kind of patio thing, but I took that out because I wanted the focus to be on the little boy running. Next slide. I changed the perspective a little bit in the final piece. There's an alley now, which is like a huge part of Chicago. I live in New York now, so there aren't really alleys, but I wanted to make sure I show, you know, the alley, like things that were part of my childhood. Next slide. So you see Wilson running and just like the beauty salon, like things like that. Next slide. This is the final piece for the ice cream truck. I had a lot of fun thinking up those ice creams with my brother. Which one would be fun, like a 6 gumball-eyed alien. All those little details, I really try to focus on every little detail because that is what was fun for me to discover in a book as a child. My dog is here with me, so if you can hear her whining, I'm sorry. Next slide. This is the final piece for that one. The sky was hard to do in this one, but I think I captured the feeling and the emotion that I wanted. Next slide. For this one, the left is the sketch. The note from the art director was the baby squirrels look too anthropomorphized with their eyes, and nothing else really in the book looks like that. So I changed it to a more accurate portrayal of squirrels. And I like how that came out better. Next slide. Here's an example of something I was trying to figure out. How do I show that the piano doesn't work? That was a hard one. In this, you can see them playing outside and you just see the piano, but you don't really, see why it's broken. So next slide. My next idea was maybe Wilson's ears are hurting really bad because he can't stand how bad this out of tune piano sounds. Hold on. And next slide. I decided to show that the piano was broken, had like a broken leg, so it's propped up on books, and Wilson is learning how to tune a piano. So I think I was happy with how that came out in the end. Next slide. This one's just another example of going through different things, trying to figure out how the school will look. So here's one image, of the school. Next slide. Tried to show more of Wilson's interaction with his teacher, and you see more of the classroom setting, but again, I changed it. Next slide. And I like this one a lot because it showed the little girl in the front kind of having a little crush on Wilson. For me, that was a fun side story. I like to put those things in, but I think the note was you can't really tell who the teacher is. And I don't think I wanted to change it at first, but I'm actually really happy that I did. So this is, next slide. This is what it ended up being. And I really like this image because you still see all those little, classroom idiosyncrasies, little interactions between kids that make going to school fun, in my opinion. But you see, the reason I really like how this one came out is because you see Wilson as like this person of knowledge who is sharing what he knows with his class, and he has like this inherent wisdom that he can share. I think that's really important in children's books, just to show like young brown children doing that, just because people are overlooked very often. And then it was also a chance to show like kind of an art classroom and show like the color wheel and how to mix colors. This is another example of showing more than what the text says. Next slide. And that color wheel kind of comes back into play later. But so here you can see like my art director sent me back this sketch, but with an older sketch I had done where you can see Wilson kind of waving. You can see it kind of inset on the right side. Also the pole she said to get rid of because it was just distracting for no reason. So I did that and I was happy that I did. Next slide. Because now you see both of them together still. And it just makes that moment more special. Next slide. For this one, I was, so this is when everyone is like getting to work and making everything happen. And I did it kind of a comic panel style, but I hadn't done that anywhere else in the book. So that was kind of like a layout, like design flaw. So I changed that. Next slide. And I'm happy I did because it was a chance to bring that color wheel thing back in and like color harmony and stuff. So, and it's just more active, like everything's happening in a swooshing motion. It kind of leads your eye around the page. And it shows like Wilson centered again, like with knowledge, like he's directing it. And I just think that's cool. Next slide. So there's that color wheel again, I like how there's that reference to that. Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna try and I'm almost done. So here this was one of the last pages. I tried to focus more on the neighbors enjoying it, but then I was like, I think I want to zoom back out. So next slide. I zoomed out with the drawing, and you can see like the neighborhood, and they're very small interacting together. Next slide. And this is how the final piece turned out. And there's a vacant lot, which there's a lot of vacant lots in Chicago. And I think I just wanted to show that, things that will make children feel like it's their neighborhood, so they feel represented and shown in a book. And I showed the Chicago skyline in the background. And yeah, so I just, oh, and the woman feeding birds, like my grandma does that. I just wanted to show that again. Next slide. So for the final page of the book, I originally was like, okay, I'll show them as close up as I have so far. But then later, next slide, I was like, well, what if maybe it'll be cool if I show them sitting, you know, looking out over it all together, like they own the city, kind of like that kind of feeling. But my art director was like, oh, I actually like their faces better. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I went back to that. Next slide. So this is like how one of my final art will look early on. Just like all the colors kind of blocked out. Next slide. And then here's the final piece. Next slide. And they ended up darkening the grass on the left side so that the text will be more legible. So like literally to the last minute, like be okay with changes happening. Next slide. So this is like how my table looked when I was working on this book. I have like a different studio setup now that I'm really happy with, but like when I'm not in New York right now, whenever I travel, I use like a Home Depot folding table and like Home Depot clamp lights, like whatever it takes to get your work done. Getting the work done is the most important thing. So it doesn't matter if you have like the best materials, you know, the best space, just wherever you can get it done is what matters. Next slide. And that's it. That's my presentation. This is The One Day House and Starting Over in Sunset Park, which was written by Jose Pelez and Lynn McGee. That's my next book that just came out in March. And I'm working on another right now that'll hopefully be out next year. But yeah, next slide. Thank you so much for being here. And it was a pleasure to share my process with you. And I hope this is helpful for some people out there.